Hi, welcome. I'm Jordan Goodyear with Beyond Identity. We're here to talk about the identity and security trends and some compliance strategies that we're seeing specifically for tech companies. We're seeing a lot of that. But again, I am the partner solution architect here at Beyond Identity. I wear a number of hats, and it's a fun time here. And with me is my colleague, Dean Sachs. And Dean, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Dean Sachs. I'm a principal engineer in the Office of the CTO at Beyond Identity. And in the Office of the CTO, I do some product work, and I also do quite a bit of standards work through the FIDO Alliance, the Internet Engineering Task Force, as well as the Open ID Foundation. And I'm excited to be here with my buddy Jordan today. Thankfully, there's no hot sauce involved today, so everything should go real smooth. But we're here today to talk to you again about these what we're seeing in the identity security space and how that impacts tech companies, and a little bit about how Beyond Identity can help you out with some of those challenges that tech companies are facing. So, Jordan, you want to give a little intro into Beyond Identity, who we are and what we do?
Yeah, Beyond Identity is an identity company founded in security. We're secure by design, and we don't do passwords. We do pass keys, and that changes the authentication landscape quite a bit. We're really out there to make sure that our customers are secure. We know that identity is the key to most businesses, as we'll talk about today. And with that, we try to engineer the solutions to be extremely secure and really easy to use from both the administrator's aspect and the end user to protect identities that the big boys may or may not do today, depending on how much you pay them.
Great. Thank you, Jordan. I appreciate that. And, I really want to focus on the fact that at Beyond Identity, there are no passwords. When I joined about 9 months ago, that was the first thing I noticed is I had one password to log into my laptop on my first day, but otherwise I don't have any passwords for any of the services that I access on behalf of Beyond Identity on a day-to-day basis. All right. Well, with that, let's get into it. Let's talk about our agenda.
Yeah, let's
Um,
go.
so, so we've already done a little bit of an introduction. So we'll dive right into the identity security trends we're seeing in 2025. We'll then talk a bit about some compliance strategies. And we should be clear from the outset, Jordan and I, we are not compliance experts. It's not what we do every single day, but we certainly do intersect with compliance teams on a regular basis. So we're going to talk about compliance at a higher level, not necessarily talk about PCI or GDPR, any of the specific compliance regimes that are out there, but talk about some of the patterns that we're seeing across these different compliance regimes and how that's playing out for tech leaders and what tech leaders should be thinking about in dealing with compliance. And then we'll wrap it up and share a little bit of information about some upcoming webinars we're having from Beyond Identity. And so
Continue
with
the
that,
story.
let's go. Let's start, Jordan. Why don't you tell us a little bit about kind of what you're seeing in identity security and some of the high level trends before we dip into some of the specific issues that have to do with tech companies?
A lot of tech companies, having worked in the past at a few of the big identity vendors, Microsoft and Okta, they have now a remote workforce. Since COVID, since everything is now dispersed and online, they have a remote workforce. And that is really challenging because, a lot of that legacy infrastructure is still behind the scenes and still vulnerable. But so is now this massive workforce in the cloud. So we see a lot of things like phishing, right? Phishing is highly successful. That's why it's so ubiquitous everywhere. And not only that, but we can see brute force attacks that are happening. We can see man in the middle attacks. You can see SIM swaps. You can see all these kind of swaps and security issues that pop up. And then you add on top of that now the advent of AI and what AI can do to make things easier for everybody, even the bad guys. And so
That's right.
when we see these trends, these are exacerbated and made easier by AI, but it doesn't necessarily change the fact that a lot of these are driven at identity. And specifically, when success happens, it makes the headlines.
That's right. And I wanted to dip into a little bit about why tech companies in particular are a target for these kinds of attacks. I mean, it's pretty obvious, right, that tech companies, whether they are financial tech companies or they are AI companies or they're large cloud service providers, they have a lot of high value data and intellectual property, right? And of
Yeah.
course, bad actors want to go after that. And we'll go through some examples of known attacks that we've seen. But I think one of the critical things that we have to consider when we look at tech companies is that tech companies tend to use other tech companies to provide their services, right? No tech company really stands alone. And so you might be using Microsoft or AWS or GCP as part of your offerings to your customers as a tech company. And that brings the risks from those organizations down to you. And so if they're attacked, then you too can be attacked. And there are some key examples of that on the next slide. But the other thing that we see is tech companies often make really good targets for bad actors because of the rapid development and deployment cycles that they experience. Everyone wants to move fast. Everyone wants to get their product out to market as quickly as possible, which is a great thing. But unfortunately, humans are human and they're fallible. And being fallible, we make mistakes. We do things like check passwords into source code repositories that then get exploited, or check API keys or other non-human credentials into source code repositories like GitHub. And these things, of course, do get exploited. Additionally, we see a lot of use of open source software, which again, a great thing and something we all depend on and use every day, myself included. But that open source software itself can be attacked, as we've seen some recent examples. I believe XZ was one of them recently, which was compromised to install. I believe it was an info stealer on that one.
Yeah, I think it
And
was.
so and so these moving fast and having these rapid development cycles, pulling in some third-party software that may in fact be malicious, does create risk, and it creates risk that has to be managed by all companies, tech companies especially, but all companies.
Yeah,
And so,
Dean,
go
what
ahead. Yeah,
to your point there, yeah, I mean, if you're a tech company investing in, all the cloud services out there, you've essentially now got a centralized place where a lot of customers are. So it's a huge attack surface there. And yeah, I mean, like I said, they're not all successful. We help a lot of our customers stay away from a lot of that stuff. I know Microsoft had put out a report last year around 99% of the identity attacks that they see are password based, right? And what are they
that's
trying
right.
to get? Well, what does Microsoft have that people want? They have the biggest customers in the world. They have the most robust enterprise cloud solution that may be out there. You can argue that with me. Dean worked at Amazon, I worked at Microsoft. But with that said, there's a lot of intellectual property and real value that those organizations, not just Microsoft has, but their customers. And that is a massive target for all of these things that we're going to talk about today. And really, that's not changing anytime soon.
Right, and in addition to the IP and the customer data, et cetera, there's also massive amounts of compute power. And of course, if I'm a bad actor and I want to go mine Bitcoin or I want to mine other crypto coins, why do I want to pay for that power and that compute myself if I can steal it from somebody else by stealing credentials? And you're right, Jordan. The Microsoft Digital Defense Report from 2024 said specifically that 99% of all identity-based attacks are using passwords. That means that about 1% of attacks are using other mechanisms. That could be stealing bearer tokens like session cookies or OAuth access tokens. Could be stealing API keys. Could be stealing other sorts of credentials that are used in various places. Or it could be phishing, adversary in the middle attacks, browser in the middle attacks. There are lots of different mechanisms by which credentials and identities are exploited. But the reality is, the biggest one still is passwords. And
Yeah.
if we can get rid of passwords, if we can eliminate that knowledge factor as a threat vector that can be easily attacked, then we can reduce these. We can reduce the attack surface significantly. Now, that doesn't mean that we eliminate it. And I think this is something that's really critical for folks to focus on, that when you eliminate the password, you've eliminated one pathway to being attacked. But there are other pathways still out there, and bad actors are not just going to say, well, no more passwords, can't attack this service any longer. They're going to go after it in different ways.
Yeah,
But
we've seen
threat,
that. We've seen that, Dean. With
yep,
just look at the SMS world, right? There's many vulnerabilities there with one-time passwords and SIM swaps and whatnot. It doesn't stop. But eliminating those passwords is a huge step in securing things, because it does make it intrinsically harder for them to get things.
That's right. That's right. And bad actors, they're like you and I. Sometimes they're lazy. They want to go. They want to do things the easy way. And if they can press the easy button, and the easy button is just buying compromised credentials off of the dark web somewhere, and they're everywhere, then that's what they're going to do. So let's move on and talk a bit about some of the threat landscape that we see today, and I'll start talking about the first two on this slide, which are Salt Typhoon and Midnight Blizzard. And so these are nation-state threat actors, right? And so we are not just looking at hackers in their bedroom somewhere moving these attacks forward. We are looking at well-funded state actors that are moving forward with these attacks against large organizations. In the case of Salt Typhoon, we're talking about telecom companies. In the case of Midnight Blizzard, we're talking about Microsoft. But these state-funded actors, just like you and I, they have day jobs. This is their day job. Their day job is to make this attack happen, compromise the target, whether it's for espionage in the case of Salt Typhoon, or for other purposes in the case of, say, Midnight Blizzard. Now, Salt Typhoon, focusing on primarily American telecom companies, seems to be related to espionage, to being able to steal data from these telecom companies, but also to determine when maybe law enforcement is looking at the communications of particular people or groups of people, or possibly even to steal information that would allow you to target specific individuals based upon their use of various telecom services, whether it's SMS or plain old phone services, etc. Midnight Blizzard, on the other hand, was again a nation-state attack against Microsoft. But the interesting thing about Midnight Blizzard is Midnight Blizzard actually used a password spray. So sending lots and lots of attempted passwords out of service until they finally found one that worked. And once they gained a foothold in that service, which I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jordan, I believe it was a demo tenant or a test tenant that they gained access to. Once they gained that access, they then leveraged that to gain access to internal Microsoft communications and plans, as well as to data belonging to Microsoft customers. And I think this is the pivot that we all need to focus on, that even large, well-funded enterprises like Microsoft, who have great security teams and great security controls, they can be attacked and they can be compromised. And when they are, that can flow downstream to their customers as well. And I think it's really critically important that we keep that in mind as we think about developing controls, developing our strategies for dealing with audit and compliance, that the attacks don't stop at your front door, right? They extend to all of your providers as well.
Yeah,
Jordan,
I
you want
mean, absolutely, that all your providers, and what's nation state stuff for me for the longest time was scariest. We have nation state stuff that maybe we're doing counter hacking and things like that, right? And so with that, this is a game. It's a chess game that we're playing with all this nation state stuff. But if we go into this Rippling versus Deal, this is not nation state stuff. This is just corporate espionage, right? This is not necessarily going across the internet, but this is having someone physically at that location feeding data back to you. And again, with the username and passwords, logging into things, those can be shared, those can be granted to others. You can have that employee or others of your competition logging into your services. And just like to your point, Dean, Midnight Blizzard, a burglar at your house gets into the window, but they don't stop in the room that they just got into. Maybe that's your living room, right? They go all throughout the house. And just like attackers do, they move laterally. And so when they gain access, they're going to try to gain more access. And so just think about that, as being, your competition trying to do this. And, that's not necessarily, popular opinion from businesses, but it does happen. And we've seen that with the Rippling versus Deal. And, that your competition is actively trying to get in. And, one of the things we did last week at our BeyondCon conference was announce a partnership with NameTag. And Dean, NameTag, I know NameTag, but they're identity proofing. And so some of these identity proofers have the ability to extend government level ID and whatnot into the organization, into the identity stream to validate and verify things. And so we're excited about our partnership there. More to come on that. But that also comes into play whenever you talk about let's know before. Know before attack was a North Korean hire that used AI to fake a profile and fraudulently was representing themselves and was able to get into the know before security tooling enterprise.
The organization, yeah,
inside the organization. And so with that, we know from what the government tells us about North Korea, what they're trying to do as far as secrets and data and scraping all kinds of stuff. But that also comes into something we have called reality check, where we actually do that biometric passwordless authentication in the Zoom environment, or soon to come in the Teams environment. So you can actually validate with a pass key that's bound to a device who that user is and what device they're coming from. So if it was coming from North Korea, even though it was AI, you still wouldn't have the physical device where my fingerprint is for this machine and be able to get in. And
yeah, I think it's really important to think about how layers of security come to pass here in order to prevent sort of this North Korean cyber attack mechanism of using users to try and get into companies. Using services like name tag to do identity verification up front and bind an identity to a credential is one way that we can limit this. This also, of course, comes into play when we talk about doing things like account recovery or credential recovery, where someone's lost all of their credentials, needs to reestablish credential. We can again use an identity proofing or identity verification service in order to support those use cases as well. And it's critically important that we think about not just credentials at the front door, but at the back door and the side door and all the different ways in which one can get a credential, because those are patterns that are attacked, or those are processes that are attacked as well, as we saw with the MGM breach by Octopus. What was it? I guess it was almost 2 years ago now.
2 years ago, yeah.
Where they went through the help desk to get those credentials.
Yep.
The other one I want to talk about here was Snowflake, because Snowflake was an interesting case where Snowflake customers were compromised. And if my memory serves me correctly, it was through the initial vector was maybe through a sales engineer and single factor credentials, just passwords used to secure some environments, that led to, I want to say it was 700,000 records from Ticketmaster or 500,000 from Ticketmaster and 70K from AT&T that were released into the wild through that attack. Is that right?
Yeah,
Jordan?
basically it was a sales engineer that had, not MFA, not on the account. And so it's just a single factor, like you mentioned. And again, whenever we get back to those passwords, they're a bane of existence. They were super convenient when they were invented, however many years ago, 45, 50, 60, 70 years ago. But today, they're just not sufficient with the rise of all the compute power we have in our pocket. These things are easy to do now that were difficult to do back then. But yeah, it was a sales engineer with no MFA, and they're actually able to see into our service as well, into their logs, to see and validate things that were true and were not true in the environment, and be able to get a picture with our services, the Beyond Identity services, to see what exactly happened. Were they compromised or not? And so with the ability to look into those logs into the service to see, has a credential been compromised, is invaluable to a customer.
Yeah, I think what Jordan's downplaying here is that Snowflake is a Beyond Identity customer, and they use Beyond Identity internally. And so we were able to quickly validate that this was not an internal breach. And then later, information came to light that this was actually an external breach through the mechanisms we already discussed. All right. Well, with that, let's move on and talk about some key takeaways for leaders, because it's important to recognize that identity is just simply a core attack vector across all organizations, regardless of their size, from big to small and everything in between. Identity is core to a number of attacks. The Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, DBIR, from 2024 noted that I think it was 24% of all of the attacks that they analyzed were identity oriented or started from some identity oriented breach. But the reality is that these malicious actors are often logging in with credentials that are obtained through prior breaches, especially when we're talking about things like knowledge factors, like passwords. So they come from prior breaches, they come from phishing, and of course, malicious actors get credentials through engineering, social engineering, the help desk, as happened with the MGM breach 2 years ago.
Yeah. Dean, it's one of those
Yeah, go
things
ahead.
where the bad guys don't hack in anymore. It's not Kevin Mitnick going in and hacking into phone systems. No, they have credentials. They log in like your normal user does. You essentially let them in the front door and not even knowing it, they're getting access to your environments.
Yeah, the Rippling versus Deal espionage, corporate espionage, the great example of that. If the employee working for Deal that was inside of Rippling had exceptional access, which it sounds like they did based upon everything that's been reported so far,
Yeah.
then that leads to the ability to exfiltrate that data elsewhere. In this case, back to Deal. And so, these are critical identity oriented kinds of vulnerabilities. What's really interesting to me right now is how AI is influencing this. And so I think it was 2 years ago, I heard a talk from Rachel Toback, and she does a lot of social engineering work. Very, very interesting person, great speaker if you ever have the chance to see her on stage. But she gave a talk where she was talking about phishing and how I believe she was using the example of Iceland. And I was recently in Iceland. And so there are only about 380,000 people in Iceland. And so a very small population that speaks Icelandic worldwide. And that, in many ways, had shielded them from most phishing attacks because, well, phishers don't speak Icelandic. However, they're starting to see an uptick in phishing attacks in Iceland using Icelandic, using the language, because they're able to use AI tools to generate really good phishing lures in the native language and then send them to Icelanders. So AI is definitely starting to change the game here. And it's providing better mechanisms for bad actors to create better phishing lures. Just last week, I think it was, I read that Troy Hunt, he runs Have I Been Pwned,
Yeah.
which has been a long time favorite service of mine to figure out, who's lost the credentials that I've given them. So Troy Hunt, security guy, longtime security guy, he got phished last week and was very open about the fact that someone phished him out of his MailChimp credentials, which, I'm a little surprised that Troy got caught up in a phish, but it just goes to show you that anyone, even the best security folks that are still human. They're still fallible. They still make mistakes. And so this really drives home the point that users can be trained to reduce risk, but they're never going to eliminate risk. And we really need to migrate to mechanisms that, like a phishing-resistant passkey, that are unable to be obtained by bad actors. They're not shareable. They're not something that I can hand over to somebody willingly or be tricked into hand over.
Yeah, I think that's huge there. The non-sharing part of it is huge. There's a lot of things with the passkey world today, and the ability to not share secrets is a big concern of mine for sure. And I know a lot of customers think that same way as well. And we shouldn't penalize the end users. We're all human.
That's right.
I mean, have I clicked on a phishing email before just to see what happens? Sure. From that perspective of knowing what I'm doing there. But yeah, I mean, people do that. We have lives, we live them, and they're not the most easy thing to do. But we've got to have a graceful way to allow users to get productivity out of them and get their jobs done, but also make it seamless and easy to use and secure at the end of the day, which is the trifecta essentially of a good service.
Absolutely. I love that. That's great. Yeah, absolutely. Because users just want to get their job done. And so that, unfortunately, is why phishing is so effective, because users just want, get out of my way, let me get the job done. And if they think they're doing the thing that helps them get their job done, they're going to do it.
Although they have come a long way since that prince that wanted to send me a bunch of money. So,
Oh, okay. Did you ever get the money?
Still waiting on it. Still waiting on
Okay.
it.
Yeah. Me too. So the last thing I have on this slide is about signal sharing. And so one of sort of the exciting developments happening in the identity space right now, coming out of the OpenID Foundation, is this work around what is known as the Shared Signals Framework, and then two profiles of that framework called CAPE for Continuous Access Evaluation Protocol, and RISK for Risk Information Sharing and Coordination, I believe. I probably got that wrong, but we'll figure that out later. I'm sure someone will drop some comments about that. But SSF, Shared Signals Framework, CAPE, and RISK allow parties to share security information in near real time between parties. And so Jordan was just in London a couple of weeks ago at the Gartner IAM conference, where we took part, Beyond Identity took part in the interoperability event run by the OpenID Foundation at Gartner to demonstrate interoperability between Shared Signals Framework transmitters and receivers. And Jordan was demonstrating from our perspective how we could log a user into Okta with the Beyond Identity passkey, and then change the state of that user device, change the health of that user's device by dropping the firewall, I think was the
Dean,
demo that
we
you used.
basically killed the firewall. That changed the status of the device, the posture of it, to not in policy anymore. And what we were able to do was we were able to send the signal to Okta to invalidate sessions. And so not only were you able to primarily not authenticate anymore, but all of your existing sessions that you had in the browser were also nullified through Okta and that shared signals event that was communicated to them.
Yeah, and so what I find so fascinating about this is now that we live in this world of zero trust and shared and single sign-on, one of the things that I think a lot of people lose sight of is once you've done single sign-on, so you've signed on through your identity provider, your IDP, and now you've done single sign-on, whether it's SAML or OpenID Connect, over to some service, could be Okta, could be GitHub, lots of different services. I won't even name them all, but you sign into these downstream services through federation, but now you've lost that context of what's happening at the endpoint and what's happening with the user, and that session lasts as long as the relying party or the application's session is designed to last. Shared signals now gives us some way to send some information over and allow that recipient to use its own policy to decide how to handle that event. And so we'll see more on this over the next couple of years, I'm quite sure, and we'll touch on this again a little bit later. But I'm really excited about this sort of future-looking work that's happening right now. All right, so let's move on. Let's chat a little bit about compliance. And so, Jordan and I, as I said, we're not compliance experts, but we do try and kind of keep up with what's going on in the compliance realm. It's an important part of being in the identity space. And in 2025, I think we're seeing a lot of changes in the regulatory environment. I know PCI just started enforcing some new rules under PCI 401, I believe it was, just earlier this month. And so these changes start to impact how businesses design, develop, deploy, monitor their identity solutions. And I think it's critically important that we understand what some of those broad-based changes are that we're seeing across the regulatory environment today. And so, compliance, Jordan, it's really kind of a business driver, right? When you go and talk to customers, what are they telling you about their compliance needs and what they're looking for from Beyond Identity to help them meet their compliance needs?
Essentially the compliance is a bar that they're trying to reach, right? They're looking to government organizations that are imposing rules or regulatory bodies that are imposing rules. And, this compliance is the end goal, right? And so that is the standard in which they want to get to meet the necessary requirements of these compliance rules that come out. And so with that, a lot of them, are being mandated, and you'll see like trends, Dean, GDPR has come to the US, and we've seen HIPAA with other things, right? There's regulatory rules that now govern what we have to do in identity, and really drive customers to meet that bar and exceed it if they possibly can, knowing that a lot of the times it's very achievable, but there may be even further security they can get beyond those. But they really, really, at the end of the day, want a solution that's easy to use and that does provide those compliance guarantees for them, and allows them to meet those bars and continue to do business, whatever that business is, being successful, and it is what their end goal is. And a compliance is kind of a hurdle they've got to get over in order to get that business done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's important to recognize that failing compliance in under certain compliance regimes can cost you a percentage of your potentially worldwide revenue.
Yep.
And so, from a business perspective, being compliant is not only necessary to gain access to a market, but also to hold on to your revenue. And so there are real strong business drivers here that through compliance frameworks that people need to respond to, and a lot of those, what we see now, are coming via identity. And so, as I spend some time looking through some of the recent compliance documents, looking at GDPR, the NIS2, which is what is that, the Network Information Security Directive 2 out of Europe, looking at PCI. I've spent some time with FedRAMP. I've spent some time with the NIST series,
Yeah.
853, 863. What we see sort of in a broad-based way across these different compliance regimes or regulatory regimes is a move toward a couple of things. Phishing-resistant credentials are a key one, and I'll call out PCI in particular on this one. PCI actually calls out phishing-resistant credentials. They call out passkeys specifically as being a mechanism to meet or exceed the compliance bar, as opposed to using passwords and having to rotate them every 90 days and having to have a certain length and complexity with those passwords. But phishing resistant credentials are sort of popping up in a lot of different places now, but they're also popping up under different terms. Sometimes
Yeah.
it's being shows up as multi-factor authentication. But I think from a leadership perspective, it's critical to understand that not all multi-factor authentication is the same. There are lots of different kinds of multi-factor authentication that provide different kinds of security guarantees. So an SMS OTP is multi-factor authentication, but it doesn't provide the same security guarantees as, say, a phishing-resistant device-bound credential, like what Beyond Identity offers, which has better properties because it can't be stolen. It can't be stolen through SIM swapping. It can't be stolen by phishing, et cetera. And so we have to be really look critically at what these controls are and what they mean and how we can actually meet those controls as we tell our compliance story to our auditors. Jordan,
Yeah.
how about vulnerability management? Tell me a little about vulnerability management and how that plays in here.
So vulnerability management, that is a theme that we see through a lot of the regulations and compliance pieces that are coming down. That is a large umbrella that covers a lot of things. But specifically, what we've carved out here is kind of the identity. And with the identity, how do you do vulnerability management? We consider identity not just the user, but also the device. And
That's
so
right.
we can get into the device itself and query, Mac, Windows, Linux, Android, all the devices, and see, does it have the patches we need? Does it meet the OS requirements? Does it have the software installed version number that we want? Symantec or Virus Scanner, Windows Defender? Does it have all those things? And so we can take the operating system as what our scope is and give you an idea of, is it vulnerable or not? Or rather, should you trust it or not? And so
That's right.
vulnerability management is a theme in a lot of these compliance standards that are coming out, both in Europe and the United States, that in this identity realm, that's kind of where we can focus on things and make sure that, the identities, the credentials aren't anything that can be shared or stolen. And then also in the context of the device, is it trustable or not? And that's where vulnerability management comes into play. There's a whole other slew of things on the software development side and whatnot, vulnerability management. But that's out of scope for this conversation here. And that's what we see is like that vulnerability management is, where can you get into the vulnerabilities and see those things? And with our phishing resistant MFA and passkeys, and then again, with our context of the device, we can now pair identity and the device security into one conversation to give you an idea what that looks like.
And I love that you use the word context because that dips into the next topic, which is context-aware authentication. And I believe I want to say that I saw this specific verbiage in the the latest PCI regulations. But context-aware authentication is really now more than just knowing about the user has presented the right credential and we're going to give them access, but where we talked about vulnerability management and knowing the state and health of your endpoints. Now, context-aware authentication, if we can pull in the health of the endpoint, the state of the endpoint, as well as the health of the user, potentially where the endpoint is physically on Earth, or has it moved to an IP space that is not trustworthy. Say it's moved to an IP space in a country that you or your organization may find to be not trustworthy, and you don't want authentication to happen from there, or access to happen from there. What we can do at Beyond Identity is pull together all of this information and actually running our policy engine block authentication before it happens, because we have this full set of context about the device and the user. And so we won't actually, based on the policies that you configure, allow authentication to happen for the user, which then prevents them from getting into those systems or services that you may want to block them from based upon that context. Now,
Yeah.
this also ties back to incident detection and response, sometimes known as ITDR, where we can also, plug into your ITDR services, things like CrowdStrike, for instance, which run on your endpoints and give us signals about the health and security of your endpoint, or whether that endpoint has been compromised.
Yeah, the ITDR space, what is it exactly? What is it? What does it mean exactly? A lot of that revolves around what customers need, essentially. And so with
Right.
that, yeah, we can plug into XDRs, EDRs, ITDRs to get signals to and from them. And so with that, that context that we're talking about expands beyond the identity world. It expands into the security of devices. It expands into the security of your network, possibly with like a Zscaler or something like that. You have the ability to expand the context in the service to match more areas of security and bring them into the identity space. And that's a lot of customers really, really enjoy that, because now you have, if a policy is out of spec with CrowdStrike, because that's what you lean on for security for devices, now you can say block authentications, or multi-factor authentication again, or some iteration of just logging it as well. And so that logging piece also is really, really, really robust with our solution, because you've got to understand what's happening, and you've got to be able to see in the past to see what the future is going to hold. And so with that response, a lot of that response is based on how our solution can basically log all the events. And like the Snowflake event you mentioned, Dean, that was crucial of being able to look into that. And ITDR, the identity threat and detection response, is a huge, huge industry. I was just in London at Gartner. They talked about it a lot there. And really understanding what's happening in the identity space is the key there.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's move on and talk about some of the learnings for tech companies they can take away today. So, I think the key thing here to focus on, and what I really focus on as someone who proudly thinks of myself as part of the Identirati, and have been a practitioner in this space for a number of years now, is that identity is core to your security strategy. It's been said identity is the new perimeter. I don't love that statement because, with zero trust 10 or so years ago, with the initial Beyond Court paper, we talked about getting rid of the perimeter. Well, identity is not, I don't love the statement that identity is the new perimeter, but identity is core to everything that we do. We need to know who who is accessing what resources and performing what actions on those resources from which devices at all times. And that is really kind of the core of zero trust. And if you don't focus on having a top-notch set of identity services, then you're probably not going to be very successful at implementing any sort of a zero trust program. But
Yeah,
this also
identity is not in
means,
that
yeah, go
stack.
ahead.
Zero trust to me is a big umbrella term as well, right? zero trust doesn't necessarily, to me, equate that there's one solution that fixes all of it, right? You've got data, networking, identity, you've got a bunch of stacks there. But yeah, with you, what you're saying there is you know, the ability to have identity as that first layer of protection on like an onion. Then, that is the new goal, is to make sure that is the securest it can be. And so that once if they don't get in, then they can't get around. And that makes it a much better sleep at night, essentially.
And beyond just the initial access vector, we've also got to think about the ongoing access and ongoing authorization, and being able to, again, getting back to the discussion we had a few minutes ago about shared signals,
Mhm.
being able to dynamically control that authorization at the app. Again, I think that's going to be an area we're going to see a lot of work in the really near future. Sean O'Dell from Disney has spoken about this quite extensively recently on the Identity podcast by Mike Schwartz over at Glue, as well as on the Identity at the Center podcast, which I highly recommend checking that one out for a good analysis of kind of how shared signals plays in here. But yeah, being able to dynamically control authorization is so critically important to protecting those resources over the long term. And that drives really toward a new model that we've really heard about over the past 18 months or so, called zero standing privilege, where privileges are dynamically assigned based upon the state of the request, the state of the device, and all of the collected data that we have about the user, the device, and any other metadata we can pull in. Are you, accessing this server because you're working on a specific ticket, and you're doing it from your corporate issued device, and that device is healthy, and you have the right credentials? It's all of that data pulled together that allows us to be able to deliver those kinds of features in the future. But I think it's also critically important that we keep in mind how phishing resistant authentication is now a non negotiable part of any identity security strategy. Um, we still see people rolling out passwords, SMS OTP, and other mechanisms. And while some MFA is better than no MFA, again, not all MFA mechanisms are equal. And so we really need to migrate toward mechanisms that are strongly phishing resistant and cannot be shared. And so you may hear about passkeys and hear about synced passkeys versus device-bound passkeys. Uh, Here at Beyond Identity, we do not do any synchronization of those credentials, because synchronized passkeys get moved to someone else's cloud. And in many cases, whether it's through Apple or 1Password or whatever your password manager of choice is, they can be shared. They can potentially be exported, or they can make their way into other people's hands. And that may not be the right model for your environment. And certainly there are places, particularly in the consumer space, where maybe this is okay. But in the enterprise space, that's probably not the model that you're really looking for. Um, Again, employees are a core vector for attacks. Social engineering is a part and parcel of many of these attack scenarios. So being able to secure that employee lifecycle end to end, from the first time you meet the employee, when you're maybe interviewing them, maybe you want to do identity verification or identity proofing then. You certainly want to do some sort of identity proofing or verification, particularly for remote employees, during the time at which you're bootstrapping their first set of credentials into your service. And you probably want to repeat that for doing some sort of account recovery. And you can think of lots of different scenarios where you may wish to inject that into a process to add a little bit of friction. If there's a question, if there's a question that maybe this isn't the right person on the right device at the right time, then maybe you want to inject that somewhere. And again, we recently announced a partnership with NameTag, and we'll, to be able to facilitate the onboarding and recovery scenarios. But we've got some other ideas in mind as to how we might use that partnership in the future to continue to provide wraparound security services. And then, Jordan, let's talk a bit about the audit team and tools, because I know you've mentioned Snowflake and a bit about the Snowflake breach. How can Beyond Identity help there with those tools to ensure compliance?
Well, I think really better insights into the service. And, if you have a service and you've got data, why can't the service tell you if you're compliant or not? And I know, we're looking into solutions that may solve for that there. But I think that, compliance it's not easy, but there are standards, they're published, they're available out there. And so you should, as an end user, be able to know whether your solution matches it or not, not necessarily without hiring a consultant, right? That'd be a real easy way to do things. And that would really, really ensure that your compliance was really, really better than most because you already had it done. You had it within the service could tell you things. And so I think really, as we look at, the future of where Beyond Identity is headed in this compliance space, I think that that's something we're heavily investing into as far as, can we make things like PCI something that pops up in your portal and shows you how you're maybe not in compliance and how you could get into compliance, because we can show you granularly on a policy whether you're authenticated or not. Why couldn't we then build services into the service that say that you met this PCI criteria or not, right?
There you go. And of course, being able to pump all of that data that we collect about the endpoint, about the user, about the authentication events into your SIM or into other systems. So you have that log data, and you can use that log data to demonstrate not only that you are compliant today, but how you've been compliant in the past, and demonstrate the actions that have happened. Again, is a critical part of that. So, Jordan, let's talk a bit about how Beyond Identity can help. And I know we've sort of touched on a number of these things. Maybe you can give us a rundown of Beyond Identity services and how we help tech companies, and really any companies, solve for these kinds of identity security issues.
Yeah, no passwords. It's very easy. If Microsoft's report says 99% of password or of identity attacks are password based, you can focus on the 1% that aren't passwords. So real harder issues there. Phishing resistant. That is a big thing for MFA. MFA is a varied term depending on who you're talking to in an organization and what that actually means. It's very ambiguous, but phishing resistant and hardware bound keys are something Beyond Identity solves for, and we can really provide you security guarantees around that. And then robust logging. Like, we have the ability to look at the service. We have the ability to see all the authentications. We can look in to see when passkeys were issued. We've got the name tag integration story coming up here. You'll be able to look into those as well. And so really the logging and the robustness of those logs are super helpful whenever it comes down to identifying trends and past events and future things that may happen as well. And so, as we look at compliance, again, like I had mentioned, we want to make this an easy solution for customers. We want them to be able to say, yes, this identity solution meets PCI compliance or other compliance standards out there. We're looking to see how can we do that in an easy way for users so that when you have our services, it's a much better story. You can go back to management and say, nope, here is our identity compliance, and here's the spit out. There's a report of exactly what we're doing and how it works in the way it does to meet that compliance. And really, at the end of the day, whenever you eliminate passwords, I'm not saying that passwords are the only attack vector that's out there, Dean. We have a lot of
Absolutely.
avenues. But whenever you eliminate passwords, talking with customers of Beyond Identity solution, they can focus on harder security problems to solve, right? They can focus on that North Korean hire, the AI agents they have to combat. They can focus on really, really hard security things and not something that is just out there in the wild that is super easily grabbable by any organization that can pay for it. And so where we focus on is the really keeping the end user of our service secure, but also keeping the administrator sleeping better at night. And that's really what our goal is to make sure that security is something easy for users and that it does actually impact an organization to make them more successful.
Absolutely, and being able to for your administrators and your security team to sleep easy at night. I cannot tell you, having worked in security at Amazon for 10 years, I can't tell you how valuable that is to be able to sleep well at night and not get late night pages, etc. So with that, I think we're about to wrap up here. Again, the big takeaways for everybody. identity is core to being a successful, secure, and compliant company in the modern ecosystem, the modern technological ecosystem. So it is strongly recommended that you take a look at how to bring phishing-resistant authentication to your users, how you can bring that to all of your workflows, so you can reduce those most common patterns of attack that are based on, again, passwords and other shareable credentials. But you can't stop there. There are so many different avenues that you have to think about beyond authentication that include authorization and being able to understand the complete context of everything that's happening from the user's perspective and from the user's endpoint device that they're working from. And this is a place where Beyond Identity can certainly help, and we'd love to talk to you.
Absolutely. Dean, yeah, I
With
know
that,
we've got
yeah.
a few more webinars that are upcoming here. We've got a content machine that's running behind the scenes here, and we want to be able to bring you more information on the services that we offer, and again, where they intersect in the business for you as an organization. So by all means, if you have any subjects that you want to talk about, find us on LinkedIn, comment on YouTube, let us know what you're looking for. This is a little agenda of what we have upcoming here in April. Big announcement there at the end, and we're excited about what the future of identity is, and we're excited where we stand and how secure our solution is as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jordan. I appreciate your partnership today and making this webinar happen. Thank you to everyone viewing, and we look forward to hopefully talking to you soon. And with that, we will sign off. Thank
Thanks,
you
Dean.
all.
Take care.